Well, thank you all for joining us for a little compliance summer school this afternoon. Um, we're going to be talking about risk assessments and audits today. And I will just quickly introduce myself. My name is Amanda Johnston. I'm a managing attorney at Gardner Law, and I specialize in FDA law and healthcare compliance. I have had the privilege of previously working in-house at United Health Group, Medtronic, and Coloplast in various legal, regulatory, and compliance roles. And since joining Gardner Law about 4 years ago, I have helped hundreds of companies, medical device and pharma companies, to implement compliance programs and help structure commercial activities in a compliant manner. And as you know, compliance audits are very, common when it comes to building a compliance program and a fundamental aspect of a compliance program. But I've noticed that compliance risk assessments are still a bit mystifying to companies. So today I wanted to take some time to do a little bit deeper dive into compliance risk assessment activities, and then we'll touch on audits as well. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar today, you can submit them via questions, and we will leave time at the end hopefully to answer them, but otherwise you can always contact me. Skip forward one. I have my email and my phone number on here. Happy to chat afterwards as well. So thanks guys for coming, and we will dive right in. And here's a brief agenda of our webinar today. We are going to start with a compliance program refresher. So I always like to start kind of at the basics. We'll talk about the 7 elements of an effective compliance program, and then we'll talk about the bonus 8th element. We'll talk, of course, about compliance risk assessments and compliance audits. And we will talk a little bit about best practices, tips and tricks, things to watch out for, and pitfalls. All right. As I mentioned, I always like to start out, anytime I'm talking about compliance topics, with kind of the basics. So what is a compliance program? And a compliance program, it's hard to define. I don't have a great definition, but this is kind of one of my favorites. So it's more than just policies and procedures. It's not something that you write down, route for approval, and never look at again. It really is an infrastructure, and it includes rules, training, penalties, responses, activities, and that infrastructure is designed to promote the prevention of misconduct, to reduce the incidence of non-compliance to laws, detect non-compliance faster when it does happen, and prevent it from happening again. So of course, FDA regulated companies, we are subject to so many complicated laws, and compliance with those laws just doesn't happen by chance. So the compliance program is the vehicle that we use to help us identify those risks and mitigate them. All right, and just again, going back to the 7 elements. So for background, the OIG issued its compliance program guidance for drug and device makers in 2003, where the 7 elements of an effective compliance program were outlined. So I'm sure this is very familiar to all of you. Of course, implementing written policies, procedures, and standards of conduct, designating a compliance officer and compliance committee, conducting effective training and education, developing effective lines of communication, conducting internal monitoring and auditing, enforcing standards through well-publicized disciplinary guidelines, and responding promptly to detected offenses and undertaking corrective action. So over the last 20 years or so, many in the healthcare compliance industry have been proponents, or there's been some proponents for the addition of an 8th element of an effective compliance program. And there's, not a lot of alignment on what that 8th element would be if it were to be officially endorsed by the OIG, but a lot of them say compliance risk assessment. And now the OIG has not yet officially adopted an 8th element, in particular for pharma and device companies. But in my opinion, it really is critical, and it's the driving force behind a compliance program. Risk assessment, that phrase, is actually not mentioned at all in the 2003 compliance program guidance, but it's definitely not a new concept in the context of compliance programs. The OIG references risk evaluation techniques. Risk is that risk evaluation and risk driving the compliance program is sprinkled throughout, but actually the phrase compliance risk assessment is not mentioned, which is interesting. So it's often a forgotten aspect of compliance programs, but in reality, it really should drive the entire program. So just what is a risk? And these are not, from the Webster Dictionary or anything, but this is how I like to think about risks and in the context of a risk assessment. So what is a risk? It's a situation associated with a particular region, business activity, or product that can present a greater possibility for non-compliance. And that could be either with policies, procedures, laws, regulations, or other requirements. So what is a compliance risk assessment? That is a structured approach to identifying and defining risks for an organization so that the organization can facilitate a targeted compliance program to focus essential resources on the most significant risks. So if you think about it, if you have limited resources, limited time, we should be focusing on the most significant risks, and it should be tailored for the company, the business area, and the industry. So why conduct a risk assessment? So first of all, regulators expect it. And I don't want to go so far as to say that they require it, but I do think it's pretty darn close. So under the US federal sentencing guidelines, companies are given credit or collaboration credit if they have a effective compliance program that incorporates a risk assessment activities. So this quote says, this is from the sentencing guidelines, in implementing a compliance program, the organization shall periodically assess the risk of criminal conduct and shall take appropriate steps to design, implement, or modify each requirement set forth to reduce the risk of criminal conduct identified through this process. And again, in the DOJ's evaluation of corporate compliance programs memorandum, which was actually last updated in March 2023, again, risk assessment is referenced multiple times. There's a whole section on it. But ultimately, it's guidance for prosecutors to use when evaluating whether a company has an effective compliance program. And the quote is, the starting point for a prosecutor's evaluation of whether a company has a well-designed compliance program is to understand the company's business from a commercial perspective, how the company has identified, assessed, and defined its risk profile, and the degree to which the program devotes appropriate scrutiny and resources to the spectrum of risks. And I really like how they phrase that in terms of devoting appropriate scrutiny and resources, because it does show that they are, they're looking for a thoughtful, targeted compliance program. They're not looking for every possible risk covered under the sun. They are looking at companies that are being thoughtful and targeted in their compliance program efforts. And among things that they talk about companies should be considering are location, industry, competitiveness of the market, regulatory landscape, potential clients and business partners, transactions with foreign governments, obviously payments to foreign officials, use of third parties, gifts, travel, and entertainment, charitable, political donations. So they go into way more detail in terms of what different things should impact what the company's risk assessment looks like and what their compliance program looks like as a result of those risks. All right, so again, no, not only is it really required, or I will say highly recommended, it also helps from an efficiency perspective. It makes sense. We want to focus our limited resources on the high risks that we have. It helps us find blind spots in terms of, are there risks that we don't know about, or maybe just having, if just the compliance officer or just the CFO is looking at things, they may not always have all the information to those blind spot areas that might be risks for the company. Again, along the same lines of kind of the collaboration or proactive approach, having a risk assessment process does demonstrate a proactive approach to compliance. It shows that the company wants to be proactive, they want to be targeted, and they want to address the risks that truly do matter and do impact their business. Employee engagement is another concept that I think really is helped by risk assessment. So when you do a risk assessment, you do engage a lot of the different tiers of employees and staff. And so I do think having that be a conversation and educating them on the process helps to engage the staff and builds a culture of compliance. All right, so how do you conduct a compliance risk assessment? I get this question a lot because there's no manual from the government. There's, you know, if you do a Google search, there's lots of different ways that it can be done, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach or process. As I already mentioned, and as the government has noted in their compliance program memo, the approach should really be tailored to the company's size, maturity, business activities, that whole long list of different factors from the last slide. So today we're going to go over kind of an example compliance risk assessment process. So again, there's no one right way. There's no wrong way unless you don't do one. But today we're going to go through just an example of kind of the high level process to give you an idea. All right, so step one is really defining your objectives and the scope. Very important. You'll want to create a risk assessment plan. So truly documenting, in a piece of paper that's reviewed and routed and approved by, all the stakeholders. Where do you want to focus on? What is your scope? And you want to be careful scoping so that it's not too large and it's not too small so as it's not very useful. So for example, do you want to include privacy in your scope? Cybersecurity, do you want to look at FDA regs? What about state laws? Typically, companies will have a compliance risk assessment, and then they'll have something separate, which is more broad, which is called an enterprise risk assessment. So thinking about those two types of risk assessment projects and how they look and how their output would be different, you'll want to think about kind of the scope of what you want to look at. If you do an enterprise risk assessment, you'll want to look more at not just legal compliance, but reputational harm, financial impact, business impact. And a lot of the times the compliance risks will overlap with these, but it's important to think about, what are you really looking for? You'll also want to think about the geographic scope. So is it the US only? Are you doing business in Europe? Is there, distributors all over the world that you'd want to include in your scope? All of these decisions should be made upfront so that you're prepared and have, appropriately resource and plan. What business units do you want to have involved? Are there certain business activities? Is it only commercial activities? Is it only research activities? So these are all things that can be modified that you'll want to make sure that you have nailed down before you start the actual risk assessment project. All right, so conducting the risk assessment. So I mentioned there's lots of different ways that this can be done. There's lots of different methods that can be used. You can also combine methods. I personally like it best when you can combine a couple methods. You can, of course, do a document review, just taking a look at, various policies and procedures, contracts that are in place. One-on-one interviews are really helpful. I recommend having one-on-one interviews with staff across all levels of the company just to get a sense of how all the other, just to get a good, objective, comprehensive look. Staff surveys. So a lot of the times I'll recommend doing even an anonymous, survey monkey or something like that with just some high-level questions. You'll want to be careful what you ask for in those questions because we don't want to, create compliance documentation issues, but I do think that helps when it comes to culture of compliance type topics. Focus groups are really good. I think having more of brainstorming sessions with a small group is helpful versus one-on-one. You can also engage an external consultant to help kind of go through some of these activities. Gardner Law is happy to support these activities, and we can of course help with more of an external objective review. So once you have gotten your methods, you have done the interviews, you're doing some surveys, maybe you're working with some focus groups, then it really becomes kind of a group effort in terms of brainstorming and coming up with a list of all the risks that you've identified. And that's when it comes, typically, it comes time to score or rank those key risks. And we'll look at some examples of that shortly. But I'm sure you're starting to see that there's a lot of subjectivity in this risk assessment process, and that's okay. There's going to be a lot of subjectivity, but we also want to make sure that we have some objective inputs as well. So whether that's an external consultant, whether that's having somebody from internal audit or someone in a function that's more independent, that would be really helpful to have. And when we score and rank our risks, we want to look at primarily two things. Number one is the likelihood or probability of occurrence and the severity of risk. So things to consider, again, legal, compliance, reputational, business, and financial. And then we'll talk a little bit shortly here about the output. So whether it's a spreadsheet, a slide deck, a heat map, these are all kind of outputs that we could consider, or depending on what you need. These are all different types of outputs or deliverables that we'll see with a risk assessment. All right, so then this next slide, if I can get it to go. Okay, so here is just a non-exhaustive list of all the different types of risk categories that you could consider when you're looking at a risk assessment. So this is just intended to kind of jog your memory. Some of these may not be applicable. There may be, this is definitely not all possible risks. But if you can look down the list, and I won't go through all these, but you can see, these are all just topics that come up that have risks associated with them. Co-marketing, consulting agreements, handling patient information, labeling changes, supply chain, practice building. Those are all just topics that when you think of a company engaging in them, there's potential for non-compliance. So this is a good kind of starting point from a risk category perspective, but it's not exhaustive. All right, so this is what I like to start out with first, kind of after you've done all your evidence finding and your fact finding in terms of interviews, focus groups, surveys, document reviews. You kind of have that group brainstorm session and you write down the category. So you can come up with different categories based on, whether it's AKS, False Claims Act, Sunshine, FDA, and then really start getting into more detail in terms of what the risk is. And then here is where, as a group or individually, a lot of the times companies will, take this on their own and rank them individually, and then we'll combine them together and see where there's overlap. And if the risk rankings come out similarly, that gives us some sense that there's alignment across the business. So for example, the category is promotional practices, and the risk is that there's off-label promotion. So here, and again, this is just an example, here the description of the risk, or a little bit more detail about the risks that was identified, is advertising and promotional materials are outdated. And there's missing words here, but that's okay. So the consequences associated with off-label promotion, this team ranked it as a 3, with 1 being low, 5 being high, but the probability of non-compliance they rated as a 4, which is on the high side. And so when it comes to identifying or coming up or aligning on the risk level, that's another subjective piece. Consequences a lot of the times will be more objective, but probability and risk level are a little bit more subjective. So again, these are just examples. I like to use this kind of as a simple risk matrix design. It helps align teams around different types of risks that they may encounter. All right, and here's an example of a heat map. Some of these are very colorful and pretty, but it just gives you a sense. So sometimes if you're reporting to the compliance committee or a board, you will prepare a heat map. And this just gives you an idea based on color, really, where your risks are. And so depending on where the scores come out, and a lot of the times companies will come up with rankings for each of these boxes, and then they will assign the risk category to one of these boxes. So it looks like, and again, this is another example. So it looks like this. So, and this is a very rudimentary heat map, but it just gives you an idea of advertising promotional, we viewed as, you know, pretty high risk. And you can see kind of where they fall and how red they are or how hot they are based on their severity of consequences and their probability of non-compliance. These are just some examples. Again, there's really no right or wrong way to do this. So these are just really some templates or something to get you started. All right, so say we've filled out our compliance risk matrix, we've made a heat map, we've presented it to the compliance committee, and now we have this lovely result or this lovely deliverable, but what do we do? And so the important part, or I guess probably the most important part of a risk assessment, is actually using it to create a compliance work plan. And a compliance work plan, and we'll look at some examples, but essentially it's a structured document or some sort of a framework that outlines the activities and the timelines involved in executing the compliance program or specific compliance initiatives. So it really serves as a roadmap for compliance activities. We want to make sure that they're properly planned, executed, and monitored. And sometimes a work plan will dictate that an audit or an investigation is warranted, or maybe there's corrective actions. And sometimes the corrective actions will be further classified into immediate, priority level 1, 2, 3, based on, again, the risk rankings, and also just based on resources and how easy or fast or short or long the corrective action process is. Monitor progress. So a big piece of the work plan and risk assessment is monitoring. It's a continual process. It's not, again, it's much like a compliance program. It's not a one and done thing. It's something that you should be using as a tool to drive future compliance activities. So ideally using a measurable method to help facilitate company tracking and trending over time. That's why we like the numbers, and I think a lot of companies use kind of the risk rankings and making it a numerical number. Again, there's some subjectivity involved there, but at least it helps with tracking and trending over time. And then I mentioned, this is not a one and done thing. Really, once we're done with all this, it's repeat. It's a continuous cycle that we want to monitor and update. Really, I recommend doing a formal review of the risk assessment every year or two, 1 to 2 years. But anytime there are changes in law, maybe changes in enforcement trends, changes in the industry, I recommend doing at least a smaller review of what was changed, just to make sure that the risk rankings aren't changing dramatically, which may trigger the company to do something differently from a compliance program perspective. All right, so here's an example again of a risk assessment. This one's very pretty as well. So the risk identified is on the left in order of risk assessment results priority. So here we're putting the higher priority ones in kind of that brighter orange. There's high, medium, and kind of a low priority, and it tells the risk. And then now we're getting into the stage where we're thinking of mitigations. So this is, once we're getting into the work plan, like action plan steps, we're thinking of those mitigations. What can we do to mitigate that risk that was identified? And we can take credit for the risk mitigations that we already have in place, but there may be additional mitigations that we'll want to consider based on how that risk level comes out to be in relation to other risks. So for example, this one, and I just use advertising and promotional materials as an example here. We could review and update SOPs. We could make sure we have the process correctly documented. We would create a maybe central repository, maybe retraining, and then monitoring. So each of these can have their own work stream or work plans under them as well, as you can kind of see how that would come. But this just gives you an idea, another way of sharing information about a compliance risk assessment. All right, and this is an example of a compliance work plan. So this shows a little bit more detail than the last slide in terms of, now we're saying, you know, the person responsible, and we're giving a timeline. So here's the risk, here's the mitigation plan that we had decided on, there's a responsible person or department, and then there's a timeline. And you can see how these are broken down into different priority levels that will help, and that is, the priority level is dictating the timeline. All right, and then if you think downstream, maybe there's a work stream dedicated to just advertising and promotional materials review, and then there's activities under that, and there's teams and timelines under each of those activities. So you can see how it can quickly add up in terms of time, resources, and kind of what needs to be done and by when. And so that's why it's important, again, to make sure that we're scoping our risk assessment appropriately so that we're not biting off too much or more than we can actually finish, because the last thing we want to do is do the risk assessment, create a list of risks, and then kind of drop it and leave it there. So we want to make sure that we are appropriately scoping that risk assessment to make sure that we are going to get out what we want to get out of it. All right, so now that was a super high level example of risk assessments and kind of one way that risk assessments could be done. I'm going to go through just some best practices, tips and tricks, just some things that maybe you haven't thought about. The first one I think is really important, and it gets missed often, and it's educating and engaging the staff. So a lot of the times, and as outside counsel, if I'm involved in a risk assessment project, we'll decide that we want to do one-on-one interviews or maybe a focus group, and someone, individuals in the company will get a meeting invite for, discuss compliance risk assessment with a lawyer from outside. And without that education and communication, that could be really unnerving to people. And so I like to have, even if there's some sort of an all hands meeting or an employee meeting, just a couple minutes to introduce the concept of the risk assessment and explain what it is, what it's not, and why it's being done. I think that goes a long way in both engaging staff in a compliance activity, but also educating them and making them feel like they're part of the process. And so when it comes time to have those discussions, it's not scary, it's not stressful, they'll be a little bit more open with you. And so I do think that's an important step that's often forgotten. There's a lot of software and technology out there that claims to be, I shouldn't say claims, that can help with risk assessment, and a lot of it has to do with the ranking. So if the spreadsheets and formulas make you nervous, there's software, there's technology that you can purchase or use that can help with some of that. It's not necessary, but if it helps you and you think it's worth it, I would encourage you to look into that, because there are different programs and services that can assist with risk assessments. Don't forget to include both objective and subjective inputs into risk assessments. So again, subjective is going to be, it's normal for the company to be subjective in the sense of they're inside the company, they're involved in the day-to-day, they kind of know what's going on. They're going to have a subjective lens when it comes to, what are our risk areas. We want to make sure that we're not, being blind to other risks that we're not always seeing from a day-to-day basis. So whether it's an enforcement trends or competitive activities, want to make sure that we're including somebody objective and independent, just to provide feedback on those risks that you've identified and make sure that there's nothing that you're missing from that perspective. So just consider, including both objective and subjective inputs when it comes to the risk analysis steps. Consider external support. So there are consultants, there are lawyers. Our firm can of course help with any of the risk assessment activities, but if it's something that either you don't have the resources for internally, or you need some guidance or just some hand holding, that's we're here to help with that. So just don't forget about using external support if you need to. Oops. One of the big kind of pitfalls, and I'll talk about this on the next slide as well, but it's just not knowing the laws, or not having a good enough knowledge of what the laws are, or what the industry climate or enforcement trends is, to actually assess that risk appropriately for the company. So if you want to have someone involved that's very strong in the requirements, and that's can be difficult if it's a really wide scope, but it's okay to use multiple internal people. You can use outside support if you'd like, but just making sure that you have a good knowledge of the laws and of the requirements, because your risk assessment is going to only be as good as what you put into it. And if you don't know the requirements that or you don't know the risks, you're not able to assess them properly for the company. Ensuring alignment on the risk rating approach and risk tolerance levels in advance. So this is one that comes up usually when it comes time to start ranking risks. It's a good idea to review with the broader team. So all the stakeholders, and when I say stakeholders, it could be compliance, legal, finance, business. We probably want commercial in there. It's kind of a cross-functional group that would be involved in these, and we want to really make sure that we're including everybody, depending on the scope, of course. But making sure that you have alignment on that risk rating approach, and then risk tolerance levels, of course, are going to vary by company. So your medium high risk might be someone else's low risk, and that could be okay for the company. It's just good to acknowledge that they're not always going to be aligned through every company. And there's just, this next bullet talks about inherent risk. In some areas, there's just going to be more inherent risk. For example, I won't pick on the orthopedic space, but there's probably a little bit more just inherent risk in that area based on past enforcement activity and, the government's perspective on some of the orthopedic business activities. And it's also important to know that risk activities a lot of the times can be the driver for audits. So for a compliance audit or even an investigation. I've been involved in a risk assessment activity that we actually were doing just some routine document review, and ended up finding some email activity that prompted an investigation. And that's okay. It can be a trigger for an investigation. That just shows that the compliance program is working. We're identifying things, and we're being proactive in identifying and then addressing risks that we see. All right, so pitfalls, watch outs. I mean, really not doing one is a pitfall. And again, as I said, there's really no wrong way to do one except not doing one. So, something is better than nothing from that perspective. You don't know what you don't know. So if you don't know the scope of laws or risks that you're potentially subjected to, you're not going to be able to incorporate those into your risk assessment. And that means that your risk assessment is not going to be sufficient, because it's not going to take into account all of the risks that are actually applicable to the company. So just again, being careful that you are, not biting off more than you can chew from a understanding the law perspective. There's lots of resources, that you can get help with that, whether it's external, internal, resources online, that kind of a thing. Too large of a scope. So I've seen this happen many, many times, where it's really hard when you're scoping a compliance risk assessment to actually cut things out of the scope, because they're all important. So for example, I had worked with a client where we did a really broad enterprise risk assessment, and it was so broad that we could have gone on and interviewed for probably a full year and we still wouldn't have had a good comprehensive kind of understanding or feel like we have a good understanding of all the risks, because we just had no limits on what the scope was. And so we just want to be very careful that when we are setting scopes, you know, whether it's commercial activities or research activities or, you know, transfers of value to physicians, we want to be careful that we are scoping it appropriately. We are not making it everything in a, you know, everything in the whole world, every possible risk, but we also don't want to make it too narrow so that it's not super useful. Because sometimes we can't, if we focus so much on one area, we're going to miss if there's some kind of crossovers in another area that could potentially implicate some more risks. All right, so just a couple more pitfalls, watchouts. Not having a work plan, so I mentioned this. You know, the only thing worse than not doing a risk assessment is doing one and then having a beautiful heat map and then just not doing anything afterwards. So we want to make sure, obviously, if you're going to go through the work of having a risk assessment, obviously that's good, but we want to make sure that we are planning and resourcing for those follow-up activities, because there will be follow-up activities and there will be a work plan to address those risks that were identified. Other things that, you know, happen from a pitfall perspective is leaving out whole departments. So forgetting about customer support, for example. That might be a great area to, you know, dig a little bit deeper to see if there are risks that you have blind spots to. So we don't want to leave out, you know, staffing levels. We want to include all staffing levels. We want to include all departments. Again, as long as that's part of our scope. But the whole point is to really get everyone's perspective and get a comprehensive perspective. And to do that, you have to really cover all of the levels and all of the departments. All right, so clear as mud, I'm sure. So hopefully that helps a little bit from a risk assessment to give you an idea of kind of what it is. I think a lot of companies just aren't sure what to do, and so they just kind of don't do anything. And you know, again, it hasn't been really called out as an official formal requirement, so I do feel like it gets forgotten a lot. But using the risk assessment process really helps target the compliance program so that you're spending time and money and resources on the risks that really matter. And I think that's the important piece. So we're going to talk briefly about compliance audits and a little bit about compliance audits versus a risk assessment, because they're similar but different. So compliance audits, and they are one of the original 7 elements of an effective compliance program. It is separate from risk assessment, but it's related in that risks should drive the audit planning. So you need to know the risks before you can conduct an audit, if that makes sense. You can sometimes do these at the same time or kind of in parallel, but really we should be auditing the high risk areas, because that will give us the most bang for our buck from so to speak. And we want to, again, put our resources where the risks are. So a compliance audit, and this is my definition that I cobbled together from various places, but it's a focused, systematic, and independent examination of a company's processes, operations, and activities to assess whether they adhere to applicable laws, regulations, standards, and policies. So we are looking at company operations to assess and determine whether they adhere to requirements. So it is a kind of look at this. It's a backwards looking. We will look at this activity to see if it matches or see if it meets this requirement. That's kind of the simplest way to think about it. So an audit versus a risk assessment. So again, a compliance audit, we're evaluating a company's compliance with requirements. And a compliance risk assessment is much more broad, kind of forward-looking. We're identifying potential compliance risks that the organization may face. And it involves assessing the likelihood and impact of potential compliance failures. So you can see how they're related, but they're
distinct. So the focus of a compliance audit is narrow, it's typically narrower, and it's looking backward at what happened and whether it meets the requirements. The risk assessment is more broad. We're looking at, current state and forward in terms of what potential risks do we face, and what's the likelihood that we have a non-compliance with any of those risks. The time frame of compliance audits is typically limited in time. They're periodic. Many states have annual audit requirements. It's also just a best practice to do an annual compliance audit. Compliance risk assessment, as I mentioned earlier, is really a continuous project. So it should be formally reviewed every year or two, but it's something that continues, and you'll want to just use it as a tool to drive future risk assessment activities. The output of a compliance audit is typically an audit report. Sometimes that audit report will have corrective actions or changes that need to be made based on the audit findings. The output of a compliance risk assessment is typically a work plan, which similarly will have some corrective actions. So when it comes down to it, the output is very similar in that we are taking observations or gaps or risks and taking that and putting it into action to correct or address those risks. So I think there's just, sometimes I see some confusion around the two. I think this helps clarify a little bit. We're happy to help if you have any questions about kind of what's a compliance audit versus a risk assessment, because they are very similar, but they're both required and they are distinct and have distinct separate objectives when it comes to compliance programs. All right, so compliance audits, best practices, tips and tricks. So again, I think this will be my mantra for the day. You use a risk-based approach, because that is the intent of risk assessments. We want to use the risk assessment to target the areas that are highest risk and do the audits there. Otherwise, it's just a check the box audit activity, and that's not beneficial. It's not helpful for the company. We want to use a risk-based approach when we're choosing our auditing area. We also want to think about current enforcement and industry trends, because maybe there's some FCA litigation going on, or maybe there's something specific to HCP meals or something that we want to audit based on some enforcement trends. Again, compliance audits, much like risk assessments, we want to have some objectivity. Audits are typically a little bit more independent and objective, in the sense that we don't want people auditing their own work. So being careful to not having the fox guard the hen house, that concept, but having somebody else, and it doesn't have to be external necessarily, but not making sure that there's independence and objectivity in doing the audit, in terms of we don't want someone auditing their own work. That kind of destroys the independence, which is a key element of an audit. Make sure we're creating an audit plan. We want clear objectives, scope, and methodologies. So similar to what we talked about with the risk assessments, we don't want it to be too big or too small of a scope. Really having something in writing. It can be short, it can be one-page audit plan with just objective, scope, methodologies, and typically the report out or the deliverable. So make sure you have that in place before the audit starts. Make sure you're gathering sufficient and reliable evidence using a variety of audit techniques. We talked about interviews, we talked about document reviews, data analysis. Observing is a really good one. We like to use observations for speaker programs. We can be a silent observer in the back virtually. And that's a really good way to, observe and watch how things are actually going. That provides some really reliable evidence that we can use as part of our audit techniques. And then when it comes down to, if you have findings and you're making corrective actions or taking action to correct the gaps that are found, make sure you fully document when findings are being addressed. We want to take credit for the good work that we're doing. again, a compliance program, if we are auditing, finding things and fixing them, that's how it's supposed to work. So we want to take credit for that. And I think we've had some clients, or I've worked with some companies where they'll have an audit and kind of it'll drop off, and we'll say they'll, I'm sure it was taken care of, but there's no tie back to close out the audit findings. And I'm not talking about QMS, kind of QSR audits. This is more of a compliance audit thing. But again, we want to make sure we take credit and fully document when those findings are addressed. And then just from a timing or cadence perspective, I really do recommend a comprehensive compliance audit every year or two. And so that would be having typically an external consultant or outside counsel. We help with compliance audits all the time. This would be more of a compliance program audit, and then we do look at some of the higher risk. We do a little bit of a risk assessment to select kind of the higher risk areas that we audit. So I do recommend, if you haven't had a comprehensive compliance audit in the last year or two, to start thinking about that. The government would expect periodic compliance audits. All right, just a couple minutes left here, but just wanted to go through a few compliance audit pitfalls and watchouts. So lack of proper planning and resource allocation. So I think, we've been involved in audits where it sounded really good at the time and then something happened and everyone got pulled different ways and it kind of just dropped off. We want to think, again, scoping properly, resourcing properly, and putting the timelines in a reasonable, or in creating and setting reasonable timelines and expectations. We want to avoid check the box audits. That's, again, if we're doing an audit, that's time, that's resources, we want to make sure that it's going to be something that's beneficial to the company. It's not just oh, we did an audit, we're good. So again, we're using resources. We want to target our resources to the highest risk, because that's the efficient way to build and maintain a compliance program. Inadequate understanding of the risk areas and compliance requirements. So if you are unsure or unfamiliar with the risk areas, it makes it very difficult to audit. You're auditing to something, and if you don't know what that something requirement is, our whole audit is going to be inadequate, in the sense that we aren't able to identify if there are gaps. A flawed risk assessment. So if we do a risk assessment and say we don't identify all the risk areas that apply, and maybe we're auditing based on those flawed assumptions, we're probably going to be auditing the wrong areas. We're probably going to be missing our high risk areas, and maybe we'll be auditing something that really doesn't matter. So that could impact, and that's how the audits kind of flow into the risk assessment. Failure to address findings, and we talked about this with the work plans as well. The last thing we want is an audit trail with a plan, a report, potential mitigations or corrective actions, and then nothing. We want to have a document trail between the findings and then the changes that were made to address those findings, to make sure that everything is closed out. If we have inadequate evidence gathering, so that we do not have reliable findings, that's another pitfall. So we want to make sure we're thinking about all the possible things we could look at when we're doing an audit. So for example, speaker program audit. We could observe a couple speaker programs. We could review the internal policies, procedures. We would also want to review the invitations, any materials that are given to attendees. If there's any pre or post communications from the sales reps to the attendees, we'd want to look at all that. So really just thinking about all the things that could be relevant. The expense report receipts for those meals, for example. We want to think about all the things that may be relevant, because if we are missing things, it's going to be inadequate and we won't have reliable findings. Neglecting monitoring is the last pitfall I have on here. So we want to make sure that if we have a monitor in place, or if we did an audit and part of the mitigation was to continue monitoring and we neglect that, that again shows that, you know, we're unable to keep up with that risk assessment approach where we want to continually be assessing and monitoring. That was a lot about risk assessments. So thanks for hanging with us this afternoon, especially with our technical difficulties. Does anybody have any questions? You can submit them in the questions box. Otherwise, you can always email me or give me a call here. I'm happy to help if you have any questions about risk assessments or compliance audits or anything related to compliance programs. I'm happy to help with any questions that you have. I know it can be kind of overwhelming to start any of these processes on your own. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, Amanda, it looks like one came in through the chat here. It says, do you know of any templates that are available for risk assessment?
That's a great question. And I mean, you can find some on Google if you Google like risk assessment template. I just ended up making my own. They're pretty simple. And I have a lot of these in here are screenshots of ones that I've either made or modified. There aren't any great like free ones that everybody uses, unfortunately, but that's a really good question. I don't see any. All right. Did you see any more come in, Allie? I don't see any more.
No, that was it. We're getting some kudos though, so great job, Amanda. Thank you.
Great. Good. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate you sticking with us. We'll send out this, or I think the slides are in here, but we'll share the slides and we'll have the recording available as well. Feel free to reach out if you guys have any questions, and have a lovely afternoon, evening.